Hey everyone, Tim here from SnapAttack. Let's dig into this week's Threat Snapshot. We're going to be hunting for some advanced nation-state malware. This is coming out of Russia's intelligence service, and this is dubbed Snake. So CISA and really a bunch of Five Eyes organizations, if you head over to this report and you see in the header, you've got all of the different countries and Five Eyes here. Their intelligence organizations have put this report together. And again, this is always very interesting when you have a deep dive on a piece of malware like this. Clearly, they really want to burn this malware to the ground. So they are exposing all of its TTPs, all of its inner workings, and they really want to hurt Russia's ability to operate and continue to use this. So we think it's very important to take a look, especially given the severity of this threat. And again, as the report says, this is one of, if not considered the most sophisticated espionage tool in Russia's arsenal. So it's always interesting to see what kind of state-of-the-art these nation-state actors are using in terms of their malware and implants. So again, just a little bit from the threat intelligence side, the background. Snake and Snake infrastructure has been deployed across 50 countries, including the US. It's targeted government networks, research facilities, education organizations. This is pretty widespread. It is cross-platform, so there are versions that work on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. We're going to be focusing mostly on the Windows version today because that's also what is really detailed here. And there are other aliases for this. So FSB, they're normally tracked as the threat actor Turla. Snake is also commonly referred to as ouroboros. Again, that's oftentimes related to one of these strings that was found in early versions of the code. If you go back to the background too, you can see adversaries and researchers have a lot of fun with this, especially in attribution. FSB changed out that string, replacing that with a glass stick back in 2014 after they were people were publicly reporting that string, and that was their attribution. So a little bit of fun there. Always fun to see something like that here. So let's actually dive in a little bit more on Snake itself, how it works. So there is a lot of really good information in here, but some of the key pieces that I want to focus on is what's the installer, what's the dropper, how does Snake get brought in here? So Turla is bundling this with a legitimate software application. There is this JPEG viewer, used to be hosted on SourceForge. I guess that's still a thing, not just GitHub or other places where you can store open source code, but they modified an open source version of the software to be able to basically have a way of passing along their malware and their implants. So they hide it kind of like almost CTF style, steganography wise. They have a bunch of PNG files in there, and they're able to extract the malware out of that through a decryption routine, and then that's going to launch. So they talk about passing off as again a malicious version of this installer, JP install or JP setup, and they have to pass these arguments to it to pull out that stage 2 payload. Stage 2 payloads are quite interesting here. So there is a persistence mechanism that Snake has. So this is going to be a service executable. They're masquerading as a legitimate Windows service. So WER fault, the Windows Error Reporting Service, isn't called WERFault SVC, it's just WERFault, but you could imagine that blending in, so that would be a very easy thing to kind of notice. And they take this a little bit more advanced too, so they're also putting this masquerading as WERFault, putting it in the Windows side-by-side directory, so it will blend in very well. There's also a couple other components to this too, so they bundle all of this information in this kind of virtual file system. This is going to be sitting in the registry. So again, they were toying with this notion of fileless malware. So instead of having that on disk, and yes, I know the registry is stored on disk, but loaded into memory. So again, having that in the registry there, being able to kind of pull and interact with that. They also have this comadmin.dat file. Again, I don't think that's masquerading necessarily as anything, but could very easily blend in as a system file. And that's going to have a couple of these other components. So there is a kernel mode rootkit. So again, that's going to be like a .sys or a driver file. There's also a DLL that they talk about here. which we'll see. And again, there's lots of, again, if you're looking for host-based indicators, there's lots of good ones peppered throughout here. So, that encrypted registry blob, they're putting this as the HKey local machine software classes. So they're looking like for a WAV file, like the program IDs that this would open with. So again, not something a user is going to look at or ever, really browse through the registry there, but, putting that encrypted payload here is, again, a very stealthy way to hide that. So we've got that. Again, that comadmin.dat file, which is where it's going to store the kernel driver and the loader, that DLL that we mentioned. Not a lot of intelligence in this report about either the driver or the DLL, which I think is interesting. Getting a hold of some samples would be really a good avenue to see if there's additional detections or behaviors that could be alerted here. We'll talk about that in a minute, but that's a little bit challenging, again, because there's a lot of components to this malware. And then there's this notion of a Q file, which they do a really good job of describing. What this really does is have information about the keying material, communications channels, other commands and things, and it's really critical to the operation of the malware. Again, they're kind of masquerading, blending in with some legitimate Windows files. So this is going in the Windows registration directory. And again, it's following the pattern of a normal file name. So they have 2 random GUIDs, and it's a CRM log file. So again, this report, if you really want to know how this works, if you wanted to, say, write your own controller for this, again, they talk about, all the inner workings, all of the commands, all of the C2, how to task the agent, how to work. And again, a lot of this is really meant to just show like, hey, Russia, we know exactly everything that this does. And again, they're really trying to burn this to the ground because they don't want Russia to continue to use this malware. They want to make them known that their operations are, again, they're compromised. So there is a lot of very valuable information in here, too much that I can't even, really talk about in depth here in the snapshot, again, for the sake of time. But if you really want to learn more about this malware, definitely take a look at this. We're going to hop ahead to the mitigation section. So they do have network-based detections. They have host-based ones as well. Again, we're going to focus more on the host-based ones because I think these are going to be easier to detect in general. They even mentioned some of the problems with the network-based detections. Again, easy for the attacker to change out, the ubiquity of encryption, making sure you have visibility into those things. You have organizations where people are, working from home and that sort of stuff. So you might not even have the sensors, the coverage, that telemetry data to even alert on network. But with the ubiquity of EDRs and things, there's a lot for the host-based detection. So again, we'll dive into a couple of these. So there is that covert store. That's a file system that is going to be stored in the registry. So in addition to that keying blob that they had, this is going to be stored in the security policy secrets hive under an N key, which is, again, interesting choice. There is that registry blob. Again, this is what's going to have some of the additional payloads and things to decrypt the system file, the driver, as well as the DLL. You've got that Q file here that's going to be stored here, and that's going to have all of the tasking commands. We've got that comadmin file, which again is going to house the driver itself and the loader. And you've also got the Windows service here that we have. So that's primarily what's going to be launching the malware from the user side. So lots of good detections, lots of things where we can replicate this. Again, given how complex this is, if I was thinking as a threat researcher, I want to write detections for this, where do I start? Given that it comes from that bundled installer, that installer has other steps that it does, because again, we've got this driver component, we've got a DLL, we've got a service executable, we've got all these other auxiliary files that are needed and setting up. Some of those are going to be put in the registry and things. We want to make sure we have all of that information there, because if I just download a sample of the driver or a sample of the implant, again, it's probably not going to work out of the box, especially with some of these things missing. And again, this has been a campaign that's been going on for years now. The attacker is going to have different versions. So I might have an older version of the binary and it's not going to be compatible with certain things. So trying to get an installer and getting that was really what I, kind of clung to as what would be a good initial starting point here. Another thing I'll just kind of mention is, again, with the SnapAttack approach, it's always very important to test your detections. And I love that we have organizations that can discuss these behavioral detections and say like, hey, these are the things you need to look at. But we're going to show a couple of pitfalls on where these things can fall short. And again, I've seen this time and time again with, say, junior analysts. And again, it's not for lack of motivation or eagerness. It's just, again, you need to be a little bit more seasoned. And when you're looking at these things, it's like, all right, I think I know how to detect this. If I copy this path here with HKLM software, that should work. Oh, I can copy, this path here with Windows. Notice they left a % sign off here for this variable, so there's a typo there. Or, if I have this path for Windows System 32, and oftentimes they'll put that in the query itself without resolving that. So to like C Windows or D Windows, if you're, one of those organizations that renames your C drive. And again, that looks like it should work. The detection isn't going to hit, which is probably likely because chances are you do not have this in your network. But if you do, again, definitely still worth looking and hunting and detecting these sort of things. But that variable is not going to resolve that way in the EDR or in the Windows event log. You're going to have to resolve that before you put that there. So these are those kind of shortcuts and those problems that, again, a seasoned detection engineer, a threat hunter, who's been doing this for a while is going to know. But those are mistakes that people can make. And being able to have queries that we can share, I think, is important. So soapbox over a little bit. Let's actually talk about how we can replicate this. And again, I said that dropper, that initial access was really the most important piece. So I was trying to see, who's seen this? How do we go about doing this? Again, there is that piece where there's kind of 2 parameters that are needed to extract, that stage 2 payload. So Carbon Black and NCC Group both, again, this is 5-6 years ago now. This is from August of 2017. Their research team was dissecting, again, an older version of this. So they wrote and open source this utility. It's, again, PNG extract, PNG dropper. Again, it's that same JPEG utility, but they also have a PNG version. And really, again, I can open up the resource file and we can see exactly, what we have on a newer sample. But this is their behavior. This is not changed since those 6 years. What's been packaged inside has changed, but Carbon Black, they go into a very good job of detailing this, and we can see here embedded in the resource of the executable, we have this PNG section, and we've got these 8 images. Again, they're binary data. They're not actually true images because, again, it doesn't display anything useful to me, but again, it feels like a capture the flag. We've got, steganography here. We've got, binary data here, which I can kind of pull out and convert into a binary and actually house an executable inside here. So very stealthy, very clever, and they talk through this quite a bit. You'll also notice here when they're talking about, again, they have a crypto wrapper variant, and in particular, this starts to look a lot like what we had in that CISA article about how the dropper, that initial installer needs 2 arguments to the file. So you're running that JP installer, JP setup, and we've got that first argument, which is that hash, and then we've got that second argument, which they prepend 1 to, and then they use for the initialization vector. One thing that is a little bit different on this research in Intel versus what CISA said, I think CISA was describing the internal mechanisms, again, that the first string is a hash, the second string is IV. This makes it look like the arguments are going to be just regular strings that are going to be passed on the command line. Again, I can't tell. It should be noted that these strings are treated as wide characters. I don't know if they actually have to be passed as wide characters in the command line or how all of that works. So that might be just kind of some subtlety where, if we had an actual sample to, really look at and test, that would be, worthwhile to discover. But, this is just something to note here. And there's a little bit of discrepancy too on like what exactly we're testing. So definitely worth taking a look at this some more. Again, their repo moved, but here is the PNG extract. Love it when organizations have a precompiled version. So there are 2 versions of PNG extract for 32 and 64-bit binaries. About a year later, NCC Group, they have, again, the Turla PNG dropper is back. They have their own blog post. I'm not going to really cover this too much. They have their own decoder. You have to compile it yourself. Usually not a big deal, but not quite as easy button if you need to go about that. I didn't see any major differences in what they described, but again, if you have a different sample, that may be worth, trying that one out as well. If you're also looking just on GitHub, what other snake information is there, I'll just throw this out here, there is a snake Q parser. Again, this is 5 years old. I haven't tested this widely. Should work. Again, looks like it would. It has OpenSSL because of this cast algorithm. If you actually wanted to see what a sample Q file is, they have one of those in here. Again, if you're writing a YARA rule, if you want to kind of analyze and see, hey, based on the behavior that was described in this Intel report, what does this Q file look like? You can definitely grab other samples, but this would be a good kind of starting point if you wanted to do the research into that. All right, so let's go back. How do I actually get this dropper? So again, there's lots of malware repositories out there, VirusTotal being the main one. And also we'll kind of give a shout out to Florian and Valhalla. There's lots of researchers that, write YARA rules. You can do retro hunts on VirusTotal against your YARA rules. You can see hits for these. These usually will be kind of tagged in the comments section. So there is this Turla JPEG view mod YARA rule that was out, again, based on the, the Carbon Black, the NCC group, research, and we can see hits here of when this has happened. So I went through several of these. I went through other samples of kind of the Turla malware implants, other hits. And again, there's different pieces of the malware. Again, the Windows services, the malware pieces, those didn't emulate all the TTPs. Most of these droppers, from what I could tell, were not emulating the exact TTPs mentioned in the CISA, et cetera report. So that's going to be a little bit challenging here, but I do want to kind of show that approach. So you can very easily go here. You can pivot to VirusTotal. This is going to show you all of these that have this Turla JPEG view mod. So I can have this signature. I can click on that. Again, I've looked at several of these samples, and you can see what's detected here. You can click the behavior tab. Sometimes these are actually run in a sandbox, and we can see what this is doing. So interestingly, it is, it looks like there is a Windows error report and some stuff here, but that's actually not the service. That's just this crashing because it's not being run correctly. But this is being hit. Again, if you are just a regular Joe researcher, you don't have access to VirusTotal and you're paying that fee so you can download the sample. Lots of other repos. You can look at this hash. You can pivot over here. So hybrid analysis, they have, again, free as a researcher. You can sign up. Now I have a download button. I can get this sample and I can go off on my merry way and continue researching. So lots of different options. Sometimes, yes, they are only in VirusTotal, but more often than not, there's other places where you can go. So let's actually pivot to SnapAttack. Let's do a little bit of threat research. So one of the things that we have in SnapAttack is this cloud range where you can actually capture, emulate threats. So we are going to spin up a Windows 10 virtual machine in our browser, and we're going to do some very quick research here. So normally if I were going to do this, and this is one of the ways that we can actually create a lot of our threats, this is what I did last night when I was putting this together, is actually running the malware in here, and we'll just kind of show those steps too. We have this capture tool, which again, all I would have to do is double click the start capture, run the malicious action, and then I would hit save. We're going to use this more as a sandbox here just for our research. So I'm going to upload some files to our VM. So I've got that sample that we downloaded. I renamed that JPEG view. I've got the Carbon Black PNG extract 64 and 32-bit version. And I've got this snake simulator emulator that I ended up writing last night. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm going to upload those files to our virtual machine. I'm going to go over to uploaded files, and I'm going to drag these over to the desktop for easy use. And also I should say, yes, this is a live malware sample. I'm running on a Mac, and I'm not obviously able to execute a Windows binary. Normally, you're going to have that, either in an encrypted zip, password protected infected, or you're going to have a different file extension. So please follow proper malware handling procedures. I'm taking a little bit of shortcuts here, but do want to give that caveat. I'm also going to download a couple of things. So I want to get Process Hacker. Yeah, we can do the setup version. Actually, it's not Process Hacker, Resource Hacker. Because I actually want to show the PNG files inside that JPEG view, because I think it's interesting just to see how this kind of mirrors. So. All right, so we have Resource Hacker installed. I'll minimize that because we will need that in a minute. But if I open Resource Hacker, can I actually drag that binary? Yep, we've got that PNG section in here, and you can see we have 8 images. Again, it's gobbledygook, just kind of noisy, high entropy data. But there's there's a binary in here that we can extract. So I could very easily run PNG extract as it is, or really JPEG view. Spoiler alert, it's not going to do anything, not what I need. So we're going to try these carbon black tools. I'm going to CD to the desktop. I am going to do PNG extract. We'll do the 32-bit one, and we'll do JPEG view, and then I need, there's 2 commands. What's the input file? What's the output file? So if that works, you're going to see out.exe popped up. If that didn't work, you could try the 64-bit version. And again, that 64-bit version is not, my architecture 32 or 64-bit. This is a 64-bit operating system I'm running on. This is the architecture of the binary. So you're going to see an error message here, unable to load JPEG view, error 193. If you look that up, basically it's trying to load library, this JPEG view, and it's not going to open that up under a 64-bit architecture because it's a 32-bit binary, and it's just basically there's 2 versions here, so just kind of know that going into it. So we have that here. I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit because we have, I should say, I've analyzed this quite a bit already. So I'm going to take take this out file. We're going to run this in VirusTotal. Again, this is that payload that was embedded here. And again, SnapAttack is a great tool for this. I could just as easily detonate this in here. I could take a look at the behaviors. We have all of those event logs. Again, you also have this in VirusTotal, so we can see some things about this one. So this is going to write files. We have this vboxdriver.sys, which again is interesting. Is this our driver that we're talking about for that kernel mode part of the rootkit? There's some other pieces here, this PC setup. And again, this is all very interesting, but this is, from what I can tell, related to a different campaign by Turla, maybe even like a copycat who's still using this as a packaging mechanism here. So there is no evidence of, again, the registry keys being written that we had talked about in there. There isn't the creation of the WER fault service. This isn't our guy. So if anyone has a sample or knows of a hash that is that initial access payload, that would be really awesome to take a look at. But otherwise, there really isn't much that we can do here with this. So I'll save you a couple hours of work. That was most of my morning yesterday, is just running through all of these different samples to see what works, what doesn't. So what I ended up doing was following the path that Michael Haig was going through, and wrote a simulator for this. So went through all of the different TTPs that we had, and I said, hey, all right, so we have to emulate the installer. So, let's create a process that has these, executable names with some arguments. Let's create a Windows service here, that's going to have that name, that path, and basically go through all of those techniques here. So there's 6 TTPs that they talk about that we're going to emulate. I will say the script you need to be running as system. for at least one of the registry keys. You have to be system to touch, not just administrator, like actually has to be true system. The other thing is if you want to install a Windows, well, really anything in that Windows side-by-side directory, which is where that service is going to be installed. So you need to be a trusted installer to actually write to that. That's an ACL permission here. And again, I can even open this up and show you. If we go to C, Windows, and we go to that Windows side-by-side folder, we go to Properties, and we go to our Security tab, System. I have read and execute permissions. I don't have write. Administrator, don't have write. Trusted installer, okay, I have write, I have full control. So you need to grab that token, impersonate trusted installer if you want to write to this. So clearly this malware, by the time it's installing, it's got system privileges, it can steal those tokens, it's doing a lot of other interesting things, which again, we could alert on behaviors and again, might clue in some different detections. So I'm going to go ahead and we are going to run this PowerShell script. I just want to show you how easy it can be to emulate this. So I am going to cd to C users, user desktop. I've got sysinternals over here, and I am going to cheat. So what is an easy way to go from administrator to system in like one command? Running psexec in interactive mode. So this little one-liner, you can see it popped up. We have a new PowerShell window. Yes, it has a CMD view. If I do who am I, I'm actually system now. So previously I was administrator, so we are good to go here. I am going to cd again to the desktop, users, user, desktop, and we're going to run our snake simulator here. So this is going to need to go out and grab a dependency. So I am going to hit yes, and this is really just so I can very quick and dirty impersonate the trusted installer user, and this is going to go off to the races here. So there's going to be those 6 TTPs that's going to emulate. I put a sleep in 5 seconds apart just so that we have a little bit of variability in the logs so they're not all kind of running together. So we're going to do that first TTP as that installer. So using JP install or using the JP setup, we are going to create the WER fault service, and again in a very specific path in that Windows side-by-side. We're going to create this registry blob file, which is where they store some of the keying material and other things, that com-admin, which is where the driver is going to be installed, the Q file, which is used for processing the communications, and then again that covert store in the registry, which is like another file system where they store, data and stuff. So we just emulated 6 of those TTPs. We've got all of that artifacts. Again, if I were actually creating this, for putting this into our threat library, I would have double-clicked Start Capture, and then I would hit Save Capture here and memorialize that tradecraft. I'm going to just go ahead and kill that virtual machine, kind of like the baking show where I showed you all the prep. That's what we just did. Let's pretend I put it in the oven, and now I am pulling that out. So what does that actually look like in SnapAttack? So again, we have our intelligence, we have our threat, we have our detections, we have that linked. So that threat that we just created is what we're going to have here. So again, I've got that snake implant, a little bit of information, those 6 TTPs, linked to the simulator. We have our recommended detections. We can actually take a look here. I can hit play and I can see, that simulator that we ran. Again, this is just what I did last night. Again, this is our pre-baked version of the malware. Everything is running the exact same. And we have all of these detection hits and stuff. So lots of cool things that, we can talk about. I could open this up on Process Graph. Again, because this is a simulation and not actual malware, I wouldn't focus as much on the parent-child relationships. I would also remind people to please think about what the underlying TTP is doing, not how I did it. So, we can even see some things here where we have detections like suspicious file created by PowerShell as system. Yes, that is suspicious, but we know for a fact that this binary is not a PowerShell script that's running. This is actually compiled binary. So thinking in context and again, using some common sense here, again, some of these detections are not going to work. These are these are alerting on how I actually implemented the simulation. These aren't emulating the TTPs, which is also usually why I like to go back to the source, go back to the root malware when we can. So again, mentioned that we do have that snake simulator. This is just a GitHub gist. Source is as is. I am not doing any cleanup commands or anything here. So this is really just, I have a test machine. I don't really care about it. I'm going to run. Inherently, this isn't doing anything that malicious because, again, we're just putting some files and registry keys and stuff in places. But again, it's really there to exercise these detections here because, again, we want to test and we want to validate them. That's what SnapAttack is all about. So let's actually talk. What are the TTPs that were listed in this threat intelligence and how can we actually alert on these? So first one is this possible Turla snake malware installer. Again, we saw that installer is usually masquerading as a legitimate open source project that's been compiled, that JP install or JP setup. It has some command line arguments. So this is a little bit more of a hunt query. We're just going to look for JP setup, JP install across all of the different, any sort of process created with that. You could also look for file created with these, but again, I'm just going off of that process name because that seems to be, a little bit more common, especially because it's going to have to be launched with these commands. I treated this and interpreted this intelligence as these are just randomized strings, but if this is actually, again, anyone has in the wild and sees they are using like a SHA-256 hash or 1 plus a random character, that might be a little bit more surgical and you could, look for those. These don't seem to be pretty common for installed software. Again, maybe it is in your organization. Always check and you can do some false positive reduction here. I would not focus in and say like, again, oh, PowerShell is going to be the malicious parent or this has to be run as system or other things of that nature. Really, we're just going to look for any execution of this process name. That's a very solid hunt query. And again, this also could work for things like 4688 logs if you don't have, EDR logs around here too. So good detection, should be pretty high confidence. And again, this is working off of some known TTPs around the installer itself. What if they change the installer? What are some of the other things? Again, this is that whole detection in depth. And the more TTPs that we can put out there, the more it's going to burn, the more that the attacker has to change. We talk about this service that's being created. So a couple of ways that we could detect on this one. This one here, I'm actually just going to use the Windows service creation event, so a 4697. As I do note here, you can also use Windows System Event 7045. Windows event logs have kind of been bolted on over time, and there is kind of unfortunately or fortunately, lots of event logs with duplicate data. So 7045 I think is a little bit more verbose at times. It can log failures and successes and other things. 4697 I think is a little bit more common, so that's what we went with. All I am hunting here is the service name. So yes, a little bit fragile if the attacker decides to change the service name. Definitely good in the rearview mirror, possibly good in going forward for a little bit, but they could just as easily change this here. I did not focus in on what the service path is, but you could certainly use that with some of the other data here, or you could bring that into other context. You can also look for where that file is being created. So again, we know that's going to be in the Windows side-by-side directory in a specific folder. So we could, modify the rule to look for that. Again, that might make the rule a little bit more brittle because what if they just change the folder name and they actually don't change the service name? So different ways that you can approach this, but just kind of tossing this out there is another possible detection. Let's talk about that registry blob. Again, it's being stored in that open with program IDs for a WAV file. It's that high entropy file. It's a relatively large, again, 1,000 hex bytes in size. So there are different ways that we can detect this. And again, I want to kind of go back to the report because the report said, hey, this is going to be in HK local machine, software classes, root, So Sysmon does these fun things where, okay, I'm going to log that as HK classes root as a shortcut instead of HK local machine software classes. So depending on how your security tool, how your EDR is going to log this, you may have different items. You'll also note in the intelligence, again, you have that colon. And again, this is where just things can get, a little bit, complicated, especially registry detection. So Is it HKeyCR? Is it HKey classes root? Could I just actually write a detection that's just looking for wave open program IDs? Yeah, that might actually be your best case scenario. This one might need a little bit more tuning because that target object that we're looking for here didn't actually hit in our log, in our database, may hit in yours, may not. That's why I added this as an OR. But again, this is why you always have to test your detections, because if I copy this over from what I think is in that intelligence report and I just trust it and I run it, may not actually be what actually is left behind on the artifact. And that's why it's very important to simulate these threats. Another one, that comadmin.dat file creation. So again, we're just going to look for the creation or existence of that file on the file system. So we're doing a file event. Again, I chose to not hardcode the C Windows path. You could do that if you want to remove a wildcard. You can also change it to D or another drive if you want. But again, if you were that junior analyst and you're copying that %sign Windows variable, your detection probably isn't going to work. More than probably isn't going to work, because again, your EDR, your other tool is going to resolve that. So we can see here, this hits, this validates, this works. So that's another detection in our arsenal. Keeping going. So that Q file, again, this is interacting with the the kind of data as it's processing commands and stuff. So from the intelligence report, this is going in the Windows registration directory. It has a format of random GUID. Interpret that as you will, .crm log, and again, that's going to have the kernel driver. So I'm writing a very basic detection, so I know it's Windows registration, and then I don't really care what the file name is. Give me all the CRM log files, and then we can take a look at those. Again, if you wanted to tune this a little bit more, we know that service is what we think, again, based on the intelligence. I shouldn't say we know until we've actually tested it. We think that it's that WER fault.exe that's going to be writing to this. Maybe it's something different. Again, there's that driver, that sys file, there's the DLL. I'm not 100% sure what the actual log is going to look like, so we just wanted to go through all of these. So again, you can see here my original script, I was just outputting the two GUIDs and the CRM log file. We did have another threat in SnapAttack, which was always interesting, and I was taking a look at some of these. Vanilla VMs, from what I could tell, didn't really have this, but I saw on a couple other VMs that have, again, been around for a while. There's CRM log files in here. The actual path has, again, the GUIDs and Windows parlance are going to have the curly braces around them. So again, if you're looking for if you have a regex detection that's looking for a GUID, string, and you don't have those curly braces, you might actually be breaking your detection too. So again, I've seen some stuff where people get a little bit more overly specific, trying to be accurate, and again, that's why I just kind of globbed on with a very basic wildcard here, but just some things to kind of note, especially because, again, detections can be fragile. Again, this is why we test. Last item is that possible Turla snake malware covert store. Again, fileless malware, they're putting this in TFS, or rarely an old FAT16 file system, in the registry. They are encrypting it. And we can look here for this registry key. So again, this is going to be in the security policy secrets. So we can see here, this is going to look for HK local machine security policy secrets here. Again, I chose to keep that a little bit more broad because is it HKey KLM, HKey local machine? How does your tool actually represent that part of the hive? Again, there's a lack of standardization here, so when we're compiling to those things, we have to do some, shortcuts and trickery to make sure that those work. But again, this is TTP number 6, tool number 6 in your arsenal. There isn't anything that they are masquerading as here, so this should be, again, another high severity, high confidence detection that you can see if you have any of this activity here. So I know that's a lot. Again, this is really interesting malware, definitely worth taking a look at. What do I want to do if I want to follow along? What other resources are there? So a couple of shout outs on Twitter. So Nasruddin, again, with all of the Sigma community detections, has written a bunch of detections. There's a candidate PR up. He's broken down some of the TTPs here, so you can see where you go from the intelligence to how you create the detection for those. So definitely a shout out there. Also, again, shout out for Michael Haig. Again, he spent some time emulating these techniques. Love the high fives. Again, going through, as a defender, I want to recreate these disk artifacts. Liked his approach. I was taking a little less of that approach because again, I'm not writing YAR rules. I'm not looking for, hey, does this file have the right size and high entropy? But yeah, guess what? If you want to move this blob to another location, you want to scan the registry for a high entropy file, it totally works. So he put together a lot of emulation. That actually kind of was what gave me the idea of, you know what? I don't have a sample here that's going to work. Let me emulate these TTPs. Again, there's a couple that he committed over here to the Atomic Red Team repo, so you can go ahead, you can use these today. There's 2 additional ones that I did, and I did a little bit different techniques. And again, because I'm trying to, again, write to that side-by-side folder, I'm trying to write to a couple registry keys, I needed system or trusted installer permissions, a little bit more complex. Might try and commit some of these to Atomic Red's repo just to share out, but again, Atomic Red, generally, again, you have that elevation required, and sometimes these detections, if they really do need system or if they do need, like, say, trusted installers permissions, they're just a little bit fragile, and that can be a little bit of a challenge here. So we'll see what we can do, but just kind of know that if you're running in here, some of these things sometimes can break, and it's worth, debugging, taking a look at. Last thing here is, again, if you want to follow along, Snake Malware hashtag on Twitter, there's quite a bit of, again, obviously these 2, very interesting tweets, as well as a lot of other, research. I see someone asking for, does anyone have a hash of Snake Malware? It's like, yes, again, looking for those. So if anyone does happen to come across, that installer that is exhibiting TTPs from here, love to take a look at that sample. Know this was a long one, but again, want to show you that research process and show you how SnapAttack can help accelerate that, how you can create high quality detections, how you can add threats to the threat library. Lots of cool stuff that we offer to help accelerate your detection engineering and threat hunting teams. Anyways, that's our Threat Snapshot for the week. It's a weekly series. Like, subscribe, comment below the video, and we'll see you next time.